Join Dr. Coffee Brown to discuss what's new in health and medicine. Dr. Brown and his guests explore the latest research and technology in health and medicine and help us understand how it affects our lives. Then they provide takeaways and steps we can take to improve our own health and the health of our planet in the future. We're glad you're here to take part in the conversation. And, now, here's your host, Dr. Coffee Brown.
Good evening and thank you. My guest tonight is a professor, emeritus faculty at University of New Mexico, Billy Brown. His undergraduate and graduate degrees are in mathematics, and he teaches calculus. Mr. Brown is actually the antidote, in my opinion, to a popular misconception, which is that there's STEM people and there's artsy people, and never the twain shall meet. So we're going to begin tonight with a discussion of a pretty famous artist, much beloved by mathematicians, M.C. Escher. And Mr. Brown, by the way, we're not related. Mom told me to say that, by the way, even though she always liked Billy better. Mr. Brown will tell us tonight what the relationship is between an artist like M.C. Escher and the world of mathematics. And it's kind of a springboard into the idea that STEM and art, or what a lot of people call right brain, left brain, a gross oversimplification, is not the dichotomy. It's not an either or choice that everybody thinks it is, and that a well-rounded mind can and should encompass both. At least that would be my thesis. What do you think about that, Billy?
Well, I certainly agree with you that they're not mutually exclusive. And I, for one, am an example of someone who has a PhD in mathematics, but also I'm very interested in music, poetry, and art, especially the art of M.C. Escher.
I'm a big fan of M.C. Escher from way back, and he's famous, I think, most famous for his tessellations, patterns that are tiles that are irregular in shape and fold into each other, often changing size as they go. Why, Professor Brown, are tessellations considered mathematics?
Well, there's a lot of fairly simple geometry underlying tessellations, especially what you might call regular or semi-regular tessellations, where the underlying shapes that Escher has modified to create shapes that are recognizable, like human beings and animals and so on. A lot of the underlying shapes from which he created those shapes are polygons, and so very fundamental, very simple and fundamental geometric objects.
Can tessellations be coded in such a way that a computer can turn, say, a picture of a cat into a tessellation of cats?
Well, I believe that's the case, although personally I've never done that. But I believe on the market there are pieces of software that one can purchase to create tessellations. I'm not sure how one would take a picture of a cat and create the tessellation of cats, although I do have an example of a student tessellation created by one of my students at a former university that is a picture of cats. So you'll see that later.
There are illustrations in many of the books on Escher of how to do tessellations. You can actually learn how to do them from some of the books on Escher, but in that form, they're iterative. They're basically trial and error. They're more and more approximations until you get what you want. But if we're going to treat it as something mathematical, it seems like there would be a predictive algorithm you could use to create tessellations. But maybe we should back up a little. To make this more of a journey, Professor Brown, what made you choose mathematics as your major, your original career?
Well, I've always found mathematics to be something that I could do reasonably easily. Of course, as I got into more and more advanced mathematics, it became more difficult. But it was something that I shined in middle school, high school, college, and so on. So it was in a sense, it was a path of least resistance for me.
And did mathematics lead you directly toward an appreciation of arts, Or was that sort of an antidote to the limitations of a STEM view of the world?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily put it in terms of limitations, but I've always been interested in music and art, and I found myself teaching mathematics at University of the Pacific in my first academic job. That's in California. And I found that most of my students were taking mathematics for utilitarian purposes. They were engineering students or, pharmacy students or management students. And so they were taking courses because they were required courses of their curriculum. And I was interested in attracting and interacting with students who were, one might say, more artistic. Like we had a music conservatory there, and I wanted some music students. And we had an art department just right next to the math department, and I wanted some art students. And I knew there were a lot of elementary and secondary education students, and I wanted some of those students in my classes. Students who you wouldn't necessarily think would take a lot of mathematics, although they were required to take some mathematics. And so I wanted to offer a course that would interest them and interest me and provide, a distribution requirement for their degrees.
This conversation reminds me of the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks constructed rather than calculated most of their mathematical proofs, as Escher constructed tessellations. And they did it for the aesthetics of it. They thought they were looking into the fundamental nature of the universe, the very language in which the gods had written the universe. But when the Romans got hold of the work the Greeks had done, they were like, how do we build aqueducts? How do we make arches that hold up doorways and things like that? They were all about the practical, pragmatic uses of it. And I can see where, to a mathematician, focusing on math as a means to an end and not seeing it as beauty in and of itself could be frustrating. I myself was very late to that party. It wasn't until after college, well, actually right before college, when I was in the military, that I began to see mathematics as an intrinsically, aesthetically satisfying pursuit. Am I touching on what you're getting at?
Yeah, I think so. I've always been fascinated with the beauty of simple and more complicated mathematical proofs. Most mathematicians, except perhaps those who are applied mathematicians, are wrapped up somewhat in the beauty of what they're doing. So beauty and mathematics certainly go hand in hand in my mind.
Today, I was looking at some of the natural constants and the universal constants. I'm impressed by the fact that certain things like Euler's constant or pi, for example, show up everywhere in the universe. The constant for gravity, we believe, is the same everywhere in the universe. And this seems to sort of endorse the Greek notion that mathematics is a sort of fundamental language of the universe. By the way, many modern physicists are talking that way again. But I know that you, we talked a little about whether mathematics is something humans create or discover. And I wonder if you might go into that a little bit.
Yeah, there are several different philosophies of mathematics. A Platonic or sort of realism philosophy of mathematics says that mathematical objects and mathematical concepts and mathematical theorems and principles are out there waiting for us to discover them, and they're sort of they just exist on their own. And then another philosophy of mathematics says that mathematics is what mathematicians do. In other words, we create the mathematics that we study, and certainly there's a very strong argument for that as well. I tend to lean towards the mathematics is what mathematicians create and do, rather than mathematics is what is already out there that we're searching to understand and to discover, although there is a lot of that as well. So I don't deny either point of view, but I sort of lean towards the mathematicians mathematicians and human beings create mathematics just like they create music, and they create, you know, visual art, and they create other forms of artistic endeavors.
It's hard to imagine an alien mind in which something like 2 plus 2 doesn't always equal something like 4. You would think our math and the math of aliens from another star system would somehow be intertranslatable. But Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead pointed out that even our own mathematical systems, the ones that are internally consistent and coherent, aren't always translatable into each other. And I confess that proof is over my head. It's not like I could explain that proof. But apparently it's something you guys accept as a legitimate fact about mathematics. That would seem to imply there could be alien approaches to mathematics that are not analogs of ours. Is that the case, do you think?
Well, I don't know about aliens, but certainly even among human beings, there are different approaches. You know, for example, in our culture, we use base 10 arithmetic mostly because, you know, we have 10 fingers and 10 toes. And so, you know, we deal in powers of 10, thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds and millions and so on. And also 1/1000th and 1/1,000,000th. So we deal in powers of 10 in our counting systems, but many other counting systems have existed, notably in the Middle East. I'm trying to remember the exact name of it, but
I was thinking of the Babylonians and their base 12 approach.
Sexagesimal, if I'm remembering correctly the right name, but a base 60 system of counting. And personally, I don't recall what the source of that was, but I guess yeah, I'll pass on that, except for what I've just said. So just on Earth, human beings have different systems of mathematics.
But
So
I haven't thought of hexadecimal systems or base 12 systems as fundamentally different. They're translatable into decimal systems. I mean, certainly if we met aliens, they might have a base of 30 or 17 or something.
Right, right.
But it would be translatable. It would be interpolable.
Right. Intertranslatable. Yeah.
So how does this lead us back into Escher, into arts? How did you migrate your academic expertise in that direction?
Well, as I was saying, I was interested in attracting students who weren't taking mathematics for utilitarian purposes because it's required by their major. And so I developed a course called Mathematics and Visual Patterns when I was teaching at University of the Pacific, and it attracted quite a few students from the arts. And within that course, I taught a unit on Escher's tessellation art and how to create it. And I taught them not only what the underlying principles of his work were, but also I taught them how to do it. And they created some really rather delightful Escher-like tessellations, some of which I can show you tonight.
You know, another place we see a lot of that kind of construction is in Islamic art, because they were, in the strictest sense, forbidden from reproducing natural forms. So they developed geometrical art forms to a very high level.
Yes, and I have several slides in my presentation about Islamic design, and the three fundamental types of designs that they used were geometric, vegetal, in other words, flowers and plants, and then also calligraphy, mostly calligraphy from the Quran. And I have examples of that in my presentation.
Well, in fact, how's about I shut up now and let you run with that presentation?
Okay, you can certainly pipe up whenever you want to. Okay, so to all you there in the audience, welcome. I must say that my enthusiasm for symmetry, which is the underlying principle behind a lot of the work of M.C. Escher, and and for the art of M.C. Escher is almost unbounded. I brought a huge collection of M.C. Escher work to Albuquerque back in the 90s for a large exhibit at the fairgrounds, and have involved a lot of students from the public schools in Albuquerque in that activity. And I will, at the drop of the hat, talk with anyone who wishes to about symmetry and the art of M.C. Escher. And so that's what I'm talking about this evening. Next slide, please. So there's a strong relationship between the work of M.C. Escher, which you see on the left, in one example called Day and Night, which you get a sense that there's some tessellation going on here. That is, repeated objects of similar shapes that fit together. And then on the right-hand side, an example of Islamic art. This is a wallpaper pattern, a wall design from the Alhambra in Granada, Spain, which I had the privilege of visiting when I was on a business trip with Intel, when I worked for Intel. And Escher also visited the Alhambra a couple of times, and he was very taken with their the geometric patterns, even though he started doing tessellations before he knew about Islamic design. Next slide, please. And on the left, you see a fairly famous example of Escher's, of an Escher tessellation called Reptiles. And on the right-hand side, you see a tessellation created by one of my students at the University of Pacific. This, I think, is my favorite of all the student tessellations that were created by students in my class, Mathematics and Visual Patterns. Next slide, please. So my first little section is about symmetry, and designs are symmetric if the design appears unchanged. I'm not saying it is unchanged, but it appears unchanged after some sort of a motion or some sort of a movement. So the four types of motions that I'll be talking about are reflection, rotation, translation, and glide reflection, which is a combination of translation and reflection. And the common words that I like to use for reflection symmetry is a mirror, a fold, a bilateral, or a line symmetry. For rotation, I usually use the word turn symmetry. For translation, glide symmetry. And glide reflection, I think, is best described by the word footstep symmetry. Imagine footsteps in mud or in snow. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to discuss mirror symmetry, or reflection, bilateral, fold, or line symmetry. So a design has a line of symmetry simply means that when the design is folded along that line, details on one side of the line will match the corresponding details on the other side of the line. And here are some examples. Next slide. So this is, if you just hold up your hands, as in this work of art here, you see that the line of symmetry is the vertical line that I've constructed between these two hands, separating the thumbs. And it's kind of clear that there's some repetition going on here on one side of the line to the other side of the line. This is called bilateral symmetry or fold symmetry. Next slide, another example of line symmetry. This is an example of a design in an in a Chinese painting on porcelain. And it's hard to see them, but if you look between the shapes that are like T's on the left and also the shapes that are like T's in the middle and on the right, you'll see little lines of symmetry that I've drawn. You can see the arrows at the bottom, at the bottoms of those lines. So this pattern has vertical lines of symmetry. If you were to fold the pattern in the middle or down that line on the left or down the line on the right, the details on both sides of the line would come together. If this was on a sheet of paper, you could fold it and have the details matched. Next slide, please. This is an example of a design in an Egyptian tomb. And similarly, between the scrolls on the left, the scrolls in the middle, and the scrolls on the right, I've drawn vertical lines of symmetry. Next slide. This is another Chinese pattern. Here, the lines of symmetry are not only the vertical lines. I've drawn one sort of towards the left of center, but also you can see intersecting at 60-degree angles at the center of that one whirligig icon there. You can see that there are lines of symmetry going off to upper left to lower right, and also lower left to upper right. So here we have sets of 3 intersecting lines of symmetry centered or intersecting at the centers of these white shapes. One of the things I like to stress in talking about symmetry is that most, if not all, human cultures have created artifacts which are decorated with symmetric patterns of one sort or another. And we've seen Egyptian and we've seen Chinese here so far. Next slide. And obviously, just like with the hands, we have in nature bilaterally symmetric animals. Many animals have bilateral symmetry in their bodies. And here's a strong example of bilateral symmetry. And again, I've drawn the vertical line of symmetry. Next slide.
Now here we have another interesting correlation with mathematics, because I've read papers in which fractal mathematics, Mandelbrot set type mathematics, were used to create symmetric patterns that match those of, for example, zebrafish and tigers and things like that. So many of the bilaterally symmetric, seemingly random or Rorschach or organic patterns in nature are actually iterations of these fractal mathematical sets. And it turns out that much of the language of DNA is written in fractals. Do this repeating pattern, at how can I say, echoing downward in scale, right, until some condition is met, at which time stop or change the pattern.
Right, indeed. I've not made a strong study of fractals myself. I have looked at them to some extent, and there certainly is a lot of symmetry in the Mandelbrot set. Okay, next slide, please. So the human brain is obviously bilaterally symmetric, although the details on either side of the vertical line in the middle do vary a little bit, but still, I think it's fair to say to most, most forgiving human eyes, there is bilateral symmetry in the human brain. Next slide. And other brains. And here's a striking example. The skeletons of radiolarians also have wonderful symmetry. If you look at any one of these, especially the one in the middle, there's a vertical line of symmetry. There's a horizontal line of symmetry. There's also lines of symmetries at 45-degree angles going, from upper right to lower left. Sorry, from upper left to lower right, and also from lower right to upper left. Some of the other ones, like the radiolarian skeleton at the very top right and the top left, and bottom right and left, also have several lines of bilateral symmetry. Next slide.
Back in the late 60s, a guy named Stuart Brand put out something called the Whole Earth Catalog. And it was there that I first got shown how, for example, logarithmic spirals show up in the patterns of sunflower seeds and the like.
Yes.
Which I think is yet another example of what you're getting at.
Yes, although I'm not going to be showing the sunflower seed, but there you're getting into the Fibonacci series, mm-hmm. which again is something I'm not covering in this presentation, but it's a very interesting relationship between mathematics and nature. So the next type of symmetry I want to discuss is translation symmetry. Back one, please. Back one slide, please. Translation symmetry or glide symmetry, a design has this kind of symmetry means that when the design is moved in a specific direction for a specific distance, the design will appear unchanged. Next slide. So here will be some examples of, this is a piece of art in the Allentown Museum of Art in Pennsylvania. The woman whose name appears at the end of that citation, Doris Schatzschneider, I think she's probably retired by now, but she was a mathematics professor at a college in Allentown, and she put this exhibit together with lots of symmetric pieces of art. Next slide, please. So in this case, this is another Islamic pattern. You can see the upper left flower when it's moved to the right to correspond to the upper right flower. So that's a specific direction and a specific distance, which that pattern can be glided. And as that upper left flower will correspond to the upper right flower, so the lower right left flower will also correspond to the lower right flower. And similarly with other parts of this pattern, the little propellers also can slide up and down to the right and to the left, and just straight across. So there's lots of glide symmetry in this pattern, not to mention rotational symmetry, and but not fold symmetry. If you have a vertical line going through the middle flowers with the yellow centers, those will be lines of symmetry for the flowers, but they will not be lines of symmetry for the whirligig or propeller parts of the pattern. So some parts of a design can have fold symmetry, but other parts of that same pattern may not participate in that fold symmetry. So there's all kinds of combinations of types of patterns. And one example I'll show you in a while of an Escher design, which has a bunch of types of symmetry. So next slide, please. This is a fabric pattern, again from the Allentown Art Museum. It's called cut velvet. That's the type of fabric it is. And I couldn't draw the little blue straight lines because they wouldn't be able to be seen in all the blue in the pattern. But essentially, most or many fabric patterns and wallpaper patterns and so on have these glide symmetries. And notice also there's some vertical lines of symmetry here through, for example, the flower-like shape at the top center and the flower-like shape in the bottom center. If you pass a vertical line through that center of this design, that will be a line of symmetry. And also parallel vertical lines through the other flowers will be lines of symmetry. So this has glide symmetry as well as fold symmetry. Sometimes these kinds of symmetries are called wallpaper designs, even though this is not wallpaper. Next slide, please. Now, the next type of symmetry I want to talk about is rotation or turn symmetry. A design has turn symmetry means there is a point which is called the center of the rotation. And if you turn the design around that point, and if you rotate it a certain number of degrees or a certain portion of a circle, the design will look the same after that turn as before the turn. And if it's a 1/2 turn symmetry or 180-degree turn symmetry, it's called twofold. A third of a circular turn, 120 degrees, is called threefold. Quarter turn is fourfold, etc. The 72-degree would be fivefold, and the 60-degree would be sixfold turn symmetry. And I have several examples now. Next slide.
And again, fascinatingly, these show up everywhere in nature. For example, starfish are 72-degree symmetry.
Exactly.
And so on. What do you have any thoughts, I wonder, Professor Brown, about why humans are so universally attracted to symmetry? It shows up in nature everywhere, but to the best of my knowledge, for example, dogs and monkeys and dolphins don't home in on symmetrical designs the way that humans do.
Well, I don't know if they don't, not being one of those.
I don't either, for sure.
But yeah, there's this idea that human beings in their various attractions are attracted to symmetric designs. Symmetric faces are often regarded as the more beautiful faces. symmetric patterns in music and so on. So I think we're attracted to things that resonate with our brains, more than other kinds of things. Although a lot of very chaotic looking paintings and a lot of very chaotic objects, chaotic music, 12-tone music perhaps, aren't as symmetric as something like Bach. But yeah, I'm very attracted to things that have regular patterns myself.
This predilection for symmetry isn't just limited to biology either. Look at, for example, crystals, how they have axes of symmetry, or look at the symmetry principle in advanced, in the standard model of physics, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
It doesn't hold up perfectly, but it's really strong.
Yes, it is. And yeah, symmetry in physics is a very, very strong organizing principle. Personally, I'm not a student of physics. I took physics, but it's not something that I've focused on very much, but I am aware of the symmetry laws of physics. I'm aware that they exist. I couldn't tell you what they are necessarily, but yeah, symmetry laws of physics seem to be very important. And yes, crystals as well, crystallography. Next slide, please. So here's a threefold symmetric pattern. This is an Islamic design. And it's pretty obvious when you have a certain fold turn symmetry that that's what it is, because you see 3 repetitions of this peacock shaped bird, and it's so easy to identify. Next slide, please. So here's a full 4-fold symmetric design in some kind of a dish. This is also an Islamic design. And notice also there's vertical and horizontal and also 45-degree lines of fold symmetry, even though I wouldn't want to try to fold a ceramic dish, but you can see that there's bilateral symmetry as well as turn symmetry here. Now there's more than one flavor of turn symmetry. The large parts, the green petals, so to speak, or leaves, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, that pattern has 4-fold symmetry, and the bluer petals on the inside have 4-fold symmetry. But if you look at the very center of the dish, the small pattern in the center may have 8-fold symmetry. I think I counted at one point. And then if you look at the rim, those Z-shaped objects going around the rim, I think there's somewhere around 48 of those. So different parts of this dish have different turn symmetries in terms of how much of a turn would take the dish to a place where it looks the same. Of course, turning at 1/48th of a turn will make the rim look the same, but it'll make the inner part of this look differently. So you see that a lot in humanly decorated objects, that you have different kinds of symmetry for different parts of it. Next slide, please. This is something that astounded me when I first saw it. A gentleman named Scott Kim created this book, and it's a book of symmetric calligraphy. As you can see, the inner part of this is just repetitions of the word synergy over and over again. And if you turn your head to the right, you can see synergy there. And if you turn your head to the left, you see the word synergy. And if you stood on your head or turned the book upside down, you'd see the word synergy. And then also notice that the word inversions at the top of the book is an exact 2-fold turn symmetry of the word Scott Kim, the name of the author. And similarly to the left and to the right, you see inversions and Scott Kim. And I invited this guy when I was teaching at University of the Pacific. I invited him to come speak to my class, Mathematics and Visual Patterns. And I had about 15 to 20 students in my class. And after the class was over, he sat at the desk at the front of the class. And as each student came up, he created a symmetric version of their name. And he was able to do that for all but 3 or 4 of the students just like that at the drop of a hat. And for the other ones he was not able to do it for, he later sent them a letter with a symmetric rendition of their name. This man is just astounding. Anyway, that's a fourfold symmetric book cover. Next slide, please. And can anyone see how many fold rotational symmetry this pattern has? I don't know if I can hear anyone except you and Coffee and
it's looking like 72 degrees to me.
Yeah, it's a fivefold rotational symmetry, which you'll see in the next slide, please. Next slide. So I superimposed a pentagon on it. Whoops, you went one too far. So I superimposed a pentagon, which I'll do in some other slides. I'll superimpose squares or triangles or pentagons or hexagons where the design has that many fold symmetry. Yeah, 72 degrees, that's correct. Next slide, please. So this is the Buckmaster fullerene C60 molecule, and it also has fivefold rotational symmetry because you can see the pentagons. I suppose in the actual, if you had a microscopic image of this molecule, you wouldn't see those bars, would you? I'm not sure what you would see if you had a microscopic image of this molecule. In any case, that's a model of the Buckmaster fullerene C60. Next slide, please. So somebody's saying a human face. What? I can't read all of that because it's covered up.
A human face with good symmetry indicates genetic correctness. Butterflies are also attracted to good symmetry. John, by the way, also corrected me that the Babylonian system wasn't base 12, but base 6, which is correct. They kind of went back and forth between them is how I would have said it, but yes.
Okay. Genetic correctness. Now, that's an interesting concept. Is John saying that a face that's not very symmetric is somehow genetically incorrect? Or is it just that we're wanting to mate with individuals of the opposite sex who show symmetric faces, show that kind of beauty?
So this gets discussed a lot in the intersection between biology and aesthetics. There is a clear preference for symmetric faces, although many of the faces we're most attracted to break that rule, like George Clooney and Bruce Willis, both of whom at some time in their past had Bell's palsy and have a remaining smirk as a consequence of relative immobility on one side of their face.
Right.
So exceptions to a rule can also excite us.
Yes.
In art school, I was taught to avoid symmetry because it's so universally beloved that they sort of considered it trivial, pandering, as it were. When I was a metalsmith, they discouraged polishing things because make it shiny and people like it was a derisive comment. But really, those are comments on how deep how instinctive these aesthetics can be, I would say.
Right. And you mentioned starfish. Next slide, please. So here's a sixfold symmetric Islamic dish. Next slide. Next slide, please. I just superimposed a hexagon there. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. So there's the ice crystal, snow crystal, which of course is famous for its sixfold symmetry. Although there are snow crystals that have threefold rotational symmetry. I have a couple books of snow crystals. They're fascinating things to look at. Next slide, please.
And again, it's not difficult to trace that sixfold symmetry of snowflakes and crystals all the way back to the 120-degree angle that the two hydrogens make with oxygen at the fulcrum in a water molecule.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, the shape of a water molecule sort of, and for that matter, the shape of molecules of all kinds of things that form crystalline structures determine the shape of the crystals. Yes. So this is a tenfold symmetric butter mold. Next slide, please. And here's a 12-fold. This was actually the pattern I showed you from the Alhambra at the beginning. So if you look at the center part, that star-shaped part in the center, that has 12-fold symmetry. But if you look at the dark lines, north, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, that part of the pattern has 4-fold rotational symmetry. And if you look at the star, like for example, the star in the center right, that has, I think that has 4-fold. Yeah, it has 8 points. Yeah, so that has 8-fold rotational symmetry. Right. So here's another example of a design which has parts of it that have different types of symmetry. And then, of course, there are also vertical and horizontal. And then through every spoke of the star in the center, there are lines of fold symmetry or bilateral symmetry. So lots of
imagine the challenge of tessellating this so that not only do you have different shapes to work with, but actually different categories, different orders of symmetry, and yet this is a repeating pattern over the surface of that wall.
Although it's not strictly a tessellation, the only regular polygons that tessellate, so to speak, are equilateral triangles, squares, hexagons. So those are the only regular polygons that cover up a whole surface without overlaps. Of course,
I think the tessellating unit of this one is the square that's outlined by the
yeah. You're right. Next slide, please. So here's the interior of a mosque dome that has 16-fold rotational symmetry. Next slide, please. And this has what I would call kaleidoscopic symmetry. It's got 4-fold turn symmetry, but it's also got lines of symmetry, vertical, horizontal. Well, you can see this where the tiles are separated vertically and horizontally, but then also diagonally. So if you think of how a kaleidoscope is created, it's created by having mirrors at certain angles, and the kinds of designs you get from kaleidoscopes you could call kaleidoscopic symmetry, because those designs have rotational symmetry and line symmetry. Next slide, please. Hopefully we'll get to Escher real soon here. I found this when I was looking for patterns in nature, and I haven't tried to count how many little swirls of water droplets are there, but it's quite a few. So a rotating wet tennis ball creates a rotationally symmetric pattern of water droplets. Next slide.
And bringing that back to mathematics, what that's showing us is that in this rotating tennis ball, the spiraling throw of water off of it shows us that the force is the same all the way around the perimeter of the tennis ball, the centrifugal force, which is not a true force, but that's what we call it.
Right. The last kind of symmetry I wanted to discuss is glide reflection symmetry, which I like to call footstep symmetry. And let's just move to the next slide to describe it. Next slide, please. So footsteps in the snow, bare feet are probably cold, but you can see that there's a line of symmetry between all the footsteps. But if you reflect one of those feet across that line, it will reflect into a place where there's no footstep. So you have to glide the footstep along, parallel to that line, one step before you get the bilateral symmetry with the foot on the other side. If this person had hopped both feet at a time, then you'd have both feet right across from each other, and that would have fold symmetry. But this does not have simple fold symmetry. It's got glide reflection. It has to be, each footstep has to be glided a ways to correspond to the footstep on the other side of the line. So that long line in the middle is a line of glide reflection symmetry or footstep symmetry. Okay, next slide. So this design has footstep symmetry because if you look, for example, at the T's on the left and then the T's in the center, they're offset from each other by half a T or something. So if you look at the T sort of in the middle left, it has to be glided up before folding it over to match the next one to the upper right of it. So there is footstep symmetry in this pattern, if you see what I mean. Does anyone have a question about that? Can you see the footstep symmetry? So whenever you have objects that are offset, like footsteps, like these T's, you're likely to have some kind of a footstep symmetry pattern. Next slide, please. This one has footstep symmetry, and again, you can see the S's are forward, backward as you move left and right up that line that I've drawn towards the left of center. So it's not too hard to recognize the footstep symmetry here. Next slide, please. All right, so I have a few slides. Next slide, please. I have a few slides of some Islamic designs. There is a room in the Metropolitan Museum of Art called the Nur ad-Din Room. It was taken out of Damascus, Syria, and transported and reassembled in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you can see several geometric patterns in this photograph, several of which I show close-ups of next. Next slide, please. So here's that central fountain, and you can see rotational symmetry here and also line symmetry or bilateral symmetry. This is an eightfold rotational symmetry pattern because there's 8 sides to the obviously to the octagon that are there, that is there. Next slide, please. And this is an interesting pattern. This certainly emphasizes the fact that Islamic culture focused on geometric patterns rather than images of animals and humans, which I think they regarded as the province of Allah to create, not within their own province. And so there is turn symmetry here. If you look at the center of the central square, there's a center of fourfold symmetry there, and you can see the 4 rhombuses, the 4 darker rhombuses around it. If you turn it to the left or to the right 90 degrees, those rhombuses will coincide with each other once again. And if you turn it 4 quarter turns, it will come back to rest the way it is now. So that's fourfold rotational symmetry. And there are also lines of symmetry. There's a vertical line of symmetry to the left of center and also to the right of center. And there's also horizontal lines of symmetry, but not 45-degree lines of symmetry. So this has fourfold rotational and parallel lines of symmetry, but not kaleidoscopic symmetry. Next slide, please. And here is another example. And this emphasizes, in my mind, the fact that calligraphy, you can see the large white calligraphic writing in some of those parallelograms, and also the vegetal shapes, the flowers and perhaps vines. And then, of course, the geometric shapes are also there. So this illustrates those 3 major parts of Islamic design: vegetal, calligraphy, and geometry. And typically the calligraphy is something from the Quran. I don't know what this says, but it might say, what's the Islamic word for peace? Shalom or salam. Someone told me what it said once, but I don't remember. Next slide, please. Now, this is a picture that always astounds me. If you see the size of the man at the bottom, and then this wall in a courtyard in Isfahan, Iran, Some people say it's dangerous for us to visit Iran, but one of my goals in life is to be here and see this wall in person, which I probably wouldn't do if I felt threatened, but it's something I aspire to. One of my bucket list things. But you see lots of wonderful geometric design. There's also vegetal patterns. And also, if you look at the upper left and the upper right, you see a vertical blue strip that has calligraphy in it. So this has all the standard types of design in Islamic design. Next slide, please. And here's a dome of a mosque in Isfahan. Lots of wonderful pattern there. The blue strip around the middle of the dome, sort of at the base of the dome, is calligraphy. And there's also calligraphy elsewhere, and certainly vegetal patterns. Next slide, please. And this is the interior of a mosque. And I can't think of very many places where I might find myself more peaceful than inside this building. Next slide, please. And just to bring up another culture, African bead design has symmetry, as you can see. Next slide. Now let's get into Escher, who lived from 1898 to 1972. He did this woodcut self-portrait when he was about in his 20s. And obviously you can see some sort of line of symmetry down the center of his face. It's not perfect symmetry. The waves of his hair are different on both sides. And looks like he maybe had his nose broken or something. But there's a lot of symmetry here. Next slide.
It's fascinating to take a lot of people have done this where you take a mirror and hold it up to your face.
Oh, yeah.
Or to a picture of your face. And you'll see that your right face and your left face, when they're reflected so that they create what looks like one whole symmetric face, look like two totally different people. Most of us.
Right. Now, as I said earlier, Escher visited the Alhambra, the Moorish palace in Granada, Spain. And here's a photo of it with the snowy mountains in the background. Next slide. And there are some Islamic patterns from the Alhambra here. These are wonderful tile patterns in the room, which is the royal baths at the Alhambra. Next slide. And this slide illustrates that Escher was very taken by these designs because this is his sketchbook. So all of these sketches are from patterns he saw in the Alhambra. Next slide. This is an early example of a tessellation. This was before he visited the Alhambra. This is called 8 heads. How many heads do you see? Of course, there are repetitions, but most people see only 4 heads here. There's 2 women, and then below them 2 men. Does anyone see 4 more heads?
Yeah, the others are inverted.
Yeah, if you turn it upside down, next slide. If you turn it upside down, you see some more grotesque. At least the guy at the bottom is very grotesque. So yeah, there were 8 heads here. So this is a tessellation in the sense that it's a repeating pattern of objects that are essentially identical that fill up the space with no overlaps. So that's his definition of a tessellation. A pattern created by shapes that are repeated and do not overlap. And they could be all one shape, or they could be, in this case, 8 different shapes. Next slide, please. This is one of his famous designs. I think I remember first seeing this on the cover of a geometry book when I was teaching college, perhaps. Next slide. By the way, let's go back one for a moment. So the type of symmetry here is glide symmetry. So you can glide one of those red Pegasuses to the left or the right, or up and down to the next red one, or up into the, at an angle up to the right or up to the left or down, and so on. And also you could glide one of the red ones onto one of the white ones. So there is a color shift, a change in color. So you can have symmetries that preserve the color, and you can have symmetries or movements that change the color. So those are two different kinds of symmetry, but the shapes are all the same in this case. Next slide, please. This is one of my very favorite Escher symmetries, fish and boat. So there might be some biblical story behind this. I'm not that familiar with biblical stories, but a giant fish consuming a boat, there must be something like that in the Bible. But I love the color. Go ahead, limited geometrical designs. You shall not make for yourself. I can't see all of that.
Limited to geometrical designs by Exodus 20, verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below.
Okay, very good.
So that means that the proscription against animal forms existed in other Abrahamic religions besides Islam.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you for that quote. I appreciate it.
John has so many good insights for us.
Next slide, please. And this is, a horse and rider. And here again, we have two different colors, but the two different colors are going in opposite directions. So what kind of symmetry is here in addition to glide symmetry?
Well, mirror.
Mirror symmetry and something else beyond mirror. Well, it's not strictly mirror symmetry. It's the glide reflection. So you have to glide one of those white horse and riders up a little bit before you mirror it to have it superimpose on one of the red ones. So there is footstep symmetry here. In fact, the horses are stepping.
My timer, by the way, is showing me that we're about 50 minutes now.
50? Okay. I think just a thought, Coffee. I think that when I finish this, I'll not go into poetry. Unless you think there's more time.
We can still link to your book, though. We'll show the link to the book of poetry. And one thing I do want to say, so we don't miss the window, is, we started with the relationship of math as the language of the universe, with the underlying physics described by that math and the symmetry that drives that underlying physics. It shapes biology, and biology shapes our brains. Most life forms are symmetric in one form or another. And you've shown many different forms. So now we're into fugues, which is one of the underlying themes of great classical composition. And fugues, of course, show up everywhere. I'm thinking right now of one of the REM songs, which is basically the same 4 bars over and over and over, yet it sounds different all the way through it. And that would be an example of a fugue. The idea that science and STEM and math and arts and creativity and poetry are separate domains is a destructive, false dichotomy, or multichotomy, I guess you could say, polychotomy. They are all part of a spectrum. They all inform each other and relate to each other. And I feel like you're doing a great job of showing us that.
Thank you. So here's an example of an Escher tessellation where we have different shaped objects. So there's a change in color, but there's also, if you take a fish and a bird together, well, this was the case with the boat and the fish. But if you take a fish and a bird together, they would form a shape. And then that shape gets repeated over and over again. Next slide, please. Here's one that has turn symmetry. If you look at where the noses of the butterflies, if butterflies have noses, or the noses of the birds, or either the tails or the heads of the bats, and I think I'm missing on the flies, the noses of the flies or the tails of the flies, there is twofold rotational symmetry there. So if you pick one of those points, like where the tails of the flies to the right center come together, if you turn the whole design 180 degrees so that the flies are going in the opposite direction, then the bats will be going in the opposite direction, and the butterflies and the birds will be going in the opposite directions. So this has twofold rotational symmetry, where like parts of like animals come together, and then also lines of symmetry at 45 degrees angle, like down the center of that string of red butterflies or down the center of the string of white birds. There are lines of symmetry as well. So this is a combination of a couple different types of symmetry that Escher was so genius at creating. Next slide. This is a very famous design called Sky and Water, which not only has tessellation involved, but it has, what's the word?
Transformation.
Yeah, transformation. I was thinking of, what's it called when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly?
Oh, metamorphosis.
Metamorphosis, yeah. So Escher has several designs which he called metamorphosis. This is not one of them, although you do see metamorphosis. You see, at the bottom, you see white fish against black water, and then up above, you see black fish or black birds against white sky. So this is, in a sense, a metamorphosis as you move from top to bottom and vice versa. Next slide, please. And here's the design I showed at the beginning. There's a sort of metamorphosis here as well. You have white birds against a dark sky, which form black birds, and then at the bottom you have different parcels of land, and you have, in a sense, a line of symmetry down the center, vertical line of symmetry, because you have a day and night. On the left, you have a village with some boats during the daytime, and on the right, you have a reflection of that village at nighttime with lights in the windows and the dark boats and so on. So it's a fascinating, one of my favorite Escher designs. Next slide, please. This is called reptiles. Notice, if you will, where the left cheek of a green reptile and a white reptile and a purple reptile come together. Their left cheeks come together at a point where there's threefold rotational symmetry. Now, there's another place of threefold rotational symmetry. Let's see if I can recognize it. To the far right in the center, the right knee of a purple reptile, the right knee of a white reptile, and the right knee of a green or gray reptile come together at a point of threefold rotational symmetry. And wherever those right knees come together in the whole pattern, you have points of threefold rotational symmetry. And similarly, the left cheeks, where the left cheeks come together, you have points of centers of threefold rotational symmetry. So this is a delightful three-color pattern. All the shapes are the same shape, but they're different colors, and they have wonderful symmetry. There's no lines of symmetry here because the reptiles are curved. Next slide. So this design became this I'm trying to think of the type of art where you use a stone to print, lithograph. So that watercolor on the previous page became, and he did that watercolor in his notebook. And so here's a picture in a lithograph of that notebook. And as you can see, the flat reptiles confined to 2 dimensions come to life and could climb up on this book and on this triangle and snort a snort of dominance at the top of the dodecahedron, and then meekly crawl back down into the page. I love this lithograph. Next page, please. This is an interesting design. It has fourfold rotational symmetry. If you look at where the tails come together in the center of the design, there's 4 different colors of fish's tails there, and they form a bit of a swastika, almost like a swastika shape there, and that is a center of fourfold rotational symmetry. Now notice also where the bottom jaw of one fish comes together with the bottom jaw of the fish next to it. So one prime example is the bluish grayish fish in the center towards the top and the brownish fish down below it. So the 2 jaws of those fishes come together, and there's a point of twofold rotational symmetry there. And this is often the case where you have fourfold rotational symmetry. You may also find points of twofold rotational symmetry, 2 being a factor of 4. And in a few minutes, in a moment, I'll show you where we have 6-fold rotational symmetry, and the 2 factors of 6, 3 and 2, appear as centers of rotational symmetry as well. So I went to the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem looking for a piece of silk on which this was printed, because I saw in a book on Escher that they had it. And I went there and I told the people in charge of the museum, you have a copy printed on silk of Escher's 4 fishes. May I see it, please? And they said, we don't have that. And so I took out my book and I showed it to him. And the footnote said that it's in the Israeli Museum. And so they scratched their heads and went back and looked around, and they finally found it and brought it out for me to see. So some of the people there didn't even realize that they had this print on silk, a beautiful piece of silk. Next slide, please. So this is the design I was telling you about a moment ago, where we have 6-fold rotational symmetry, 2-fold rotational symmetry, and 3-fold rotational symmetry, all in the same design. Now, I'm going to ask you to look at it for a moment and see if you can find what you want to look for is where 6 objects come together in the same place. There'll be 3 different colors, two whites, 2 reds, 2 blacks, a part of this reptile. On all 6 of those reptiles come together at the same place. Did anybody see it? If you look sort of towards the lower right, you'll see the left thumb of the reptile that's white to the right, and then the other reptile that's down to the left of him that's also in white. And then you see 2 red left thumbs and 2 black left thumbs all coming together in a spiral shape there, in a place of 6-fold rotational symmetry. Flash ahead to the next slide and I'll show you what I mean. So it's where this hexagon is down to the lower right. Now go back 1 slide. So you see where that hexagon was. Now, like I said, when you have 6-fold rotational symmetry, you're likely to have 3-fold and 2-fold as well. If you look at the 2 white reptiles in the center bottom, look where their tails come together. That is a place of 2-fold rotational symmetry. And then let's see if I can find the 3-fold somewhere. I may have to look at where I put the triangles on the next slide. Let's go to the next slide so I don't waste a lot of time. So notice right in the center, there's a blue, I tried to make it equilateral, but it's not equilateral. There's a blue triangle there. Now let's go back to the previous slide. And you can see where the right knee of the white reptile and the right knee of the red reptile and the right knee of the black reptile come together at a point of 3-fold rotational symmetry. So this is about as complicated as it gets as far as Escher's designs are concerned. So it's a combination of 6-fold, 2-fold, and 3-fold rotational symmetry. And of course, there's also the glide symmetry. So it's a wallpaper design. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'll skip that one. Next slide. This is called Sun and Moon. You can see sort of white birds in a sunshiny sky, and you can see black birds in a nighttime sky with stars and so on. Very creative. Next slide, please. And Escher was introduced to this design by a Canadian geometry professor, a very famous guy, H.S.M. Coxeter. And Escher saw this as a tessellation of non-Euclidean space. And so he started creating some tessellation designs of this non-Euclidean space, the next slide of which is one of them. Next slide. So devils and angels. And you can see as you get closer and closer to the perimeter, they get smaller and smaller. But in the geometry of this non-Euclidean geometry, they're all the same size. I mean, they look different sizes to us, but in that geometry, all of these objects are the same size. All the devils and the bats and all the angels are the same size. Circle limit 4. He also did a circle limit 1, 2, and 3, which I'm not showing. And the next slide shows his very fine, oops, not quite. The next one after this one.
I was going to say, Escher did all this by a very different methodology, but look at how these presage the Mandelbrot sets, which actually occurred decades later. Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, very good point. So as you get smaller and smaller, there's self-similarity going on. So you get repetition of the same motifs over and over again at smaller and smaller scales. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Next slide. So when Escher's son came to Albuquerque, when we had the huge Escher exhibit, he gave a talk, and somebody asked him, "What is your favorite design done by your father?" And he said, "This is," because it reminds him of the pleasure that his father's hands brought to many, many, many thousands of people with his creations. So drawing hands was George Escher's favorite design of his father. George Escher became an engineer, and he moved to one of the maritime provinces in Canada, and he donated a huge collection of his father's work to the National Gallery in Ottawa, Canada, which is on my bucket list. Not been to that one. Next slide, please. And this is the last design that Escher created. Obviously has 3-fold rotational symmetry, and it has hints of fractal geometry again. By getting smaller and smaller, both towards the center and towards the rim. But what a genius, in my mind, what a genius thing to do is to interweave these snakes in this geometric design. All right, so now quickly, I'm going to show you a few designs that some of my students created, and then I'll be done. So I taught this course back in the early 80s before I moved away from University of the Pacific. Next slide. Cats and birds. Glide symmetry. Next slide. Dogs of different colors. So when you get a repetition of the same shape over and over again, it makes it much more interesting if you color them different colors. And this girl, Laura Haskett, did a lovely job. Next slide. And here again, the same shape, all birds, but coloring in a lovely variation of colors.
Yeah, from an artistic standpoint, what they've done here is used a repeating pattern, but a non-repeating color evolution.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Next slide. Here's the, you know what? I thought that this was going to be cats, but it's not cats. Because you mentioned, can you take cats and tessellate with them? No, but you can penguins. Next slide, please. And this is a lovely set of parrots from Jamie Dunlap. Next slide. And this is just really beautiful.
Yeah.
And, you know, the choice not to color in some of them, but just color in a few of them was a really wonderful artistic choice. These were, many of these students were art students, and I was so happy to attract them to my course. Next slide, please. And this is the Cat's Eyes by Kana Aoki, a student from Hawaii who was an art major. Next slide, please. And this girl thought of this as a proposal to a cosmetics manufacturer on, you know, advertising their various cosmetics, which I thought was quite creative. Next slide. And this is a pretty standard thing. It has lovely symmetry, stained glass with lovely symmetry, line symmetry, rotation symmetry, etc. Next slide. And this is a really complicated one, also done by Susie Merrick. This has six-fold rotational symmetry. If you look just above the center, there's a place where 6 of those petals come together. 3 blue and 3 pinkish ones. And there's other places where 6 come together. And there's other places where 3 come together. So there's threefold rotational symmetry. And I bet there are also places with twofold, but I'm not seeing them just offhand. And now I think the last 3 slides, go ahead, next slide. Not quite, one more after this one. The secret behind it all. So this is the secret of how to create these tessellations. So next slide. So this is the simplest kind, where you take a square, look at the bottom. If you take a square and you alter the bottom side, and then you glide that alteration up to the top and create the same alteration of the top side, and similarly with left and right, you get a shape that tessellates, because what you've done is you've created an indentation at the bottom, which receives the, you know, protrusion at the top, and the same thing with left and right. So you can just fit a bunch of those together. And I think she did a nice job of coloring these. And of course you have a choice as to whether the bottom one goes over the left one or goes under it. So you have a choice when they overlap as to how they're going to overlap. Next slide. Look, this is, you do the same thing with hexagons. A regular hexagon having 6 sides has 3 pairs of opposite sides. So if you change the top and make that change, same change to the bottom, and the same with the lower right and the upper left, and the same thing with the lower left and the upper right, make those changes, same changes to the opposite sides, then they will create a hexagonal tessellation. And finally, the last one is a way of using equilateral triangles. Well, equilateral triangles don't have opposite sides. They have adjacent sides. So if you'll notice, the alteration first made to the left-hand side of this triangle, then if you rotate it, you anchor it at the top, and you rotate it around to make that same alteration to the right-hand side, then a bunch of those will fit together in a 6-fold rotational symmetric pattern. As you can see, for example, if you look at the right hand, the middle right hand motif, you see 6 of those shapes, 2 yellows, 2 reds, and 2 blues, all fitting together in a 6-fold rotational symmetric pattern. So I think that's it, unless there are questions. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Now, Professor Brown, part of the reason I really wanted to hear you riff on all this is I cannot stress strongly enough how important I think it is for people to understand that science is a creative, imaginative effort.
Absolutely.
We, as undergraduates, tend to learn science as a bunch of factoids in textbooks, but that is not science. That is the product of science.
Right.
All that stuff was stuff that was unknown until somebody thought it might be and then tested to find out whether it was so. Until Newton thought about analyzing gravity in mathematical terms, we did not understand the orbit of the planets. Linus Pauling once said that in order to have a good idea, you should have a lot of ideas. Creativity is absolutely the bedrock of science, not the memorization of factoids. And to develop this creativity, to develop a wide, free-range kind of mind that can wander across the known and speculate about the unknown and then test the validity of those speculations, requires the development of both sides of our brain. So to me, if we were to remove the liberal arts from STEM education, we would cripple the next generation of scientists by turning them into a generation of memorizers rather than creators.
Exactly. Right. Recently I saw a show on public television about, what was it about? It was basically about particle physics, not highly technical, but the creativity involved in constructing the equipment to run the sorts of experiments that one needs to run in order to find some new quark or some, what was the latest particle that was finally discovered? I forget what it's called offhand now, but the creativity involved in designing these pieces of equipment to do these experiments is just unbelievable.
Well, here's a primer for budding young scientists out there. The first step is to say, what could explain what I'm looking at? The second step is to say, how would I test that? What would that look like? The third step is to say, what else could give me the same results? And the fourth step is to say, what test can I design that would differentiate between this explanation for those results and alternative explanations for those results? And then finally, you make novel predictions. Every theory predicts the past, but good theories predict the future.
Yeah. Yeah, well, listen, this has been very enjoyable for me. Like I said, at the drop of the hat, I can talk to anyone who'd like to listen about symmetry and MC Escher and tessellations and so on. It's a great pleasure. And if you think there might be time, I might read one poem and show you the cover of my book.
Well, go for it. And then we'll wrap up with that. We'll let that be our sign off.
Okay. So for those of you who may not be familiar with this side of me, I have been a poet since my daughter died in a car crash in 1996. So it's been 25 years since my daughter died. And before that, I hated poetry for about 40 years due to being embarrassed by my high school English teacher during a poetry lesson. And I found that writing poetry was very healing for me. And so the expression of deep and profound feelings in poetry became a mantra for me. And for the last 14 years, I've been conducting monthly poetry readings. And the poets who've read at my poetry readings for the last, 14 times 12, 14 times 11 is something like 154 poetry readings. Those people who've read poems, my poetry readings are called fixed and free poetry. Those poets qualify to submit poems for my anthologies. And this is the fourth of my anthologies, Fixed and Free Poetry Anthology 2021, which just came out. And this book has about, it has more than 500 poems in it. And I've selected a few, but I think I'll just read one. So just give me a moment while I select that one. I think I'll read the poem of my own that I was planning to read. I actually selected 6 or 8 of them, but only one of my own. And I think I will read that one. So there may be some golfers in the audience, and you may have watched the Masters tournament like I did. I think it was the first time the Masters tournament was in the fall. And During the Masters tournament, there was an advertisement, and this poem was provoked by that advertisement. It's called She Made It. She Made It. In a televised advertisement during the Masters golf tournament, a young girl wearing a visor over her long dark hair addressed a long putt, carefully plots the path, takes a deep breath to relax her muscles, strikes the ball. It curves toward the hole where her father holds the pin, encourages the ball forward, saying, "Get legs, get legs." The ball seems to hesitate at the lip of the cup, then plunks into the hole, rattles at the bottom. She jumps with joy, scampers across the green into her father's arms, receives a big hug of congratulations. They hurry to their golf cart. She's giggling her satisfaction. I don't register the sponsor of the advertisement. I thwart my tears, stifle my sobs, as my daughter will never again jump with joy, giggle her satisfaction. I'll no longer hug her in congratulations. 25 years ago, when she was 18, Elizabeth died in a car crash. So there's a deep feeling for you.
And on that note, thank you so much, Professor Brown, for helping us tonight.
My pleasure. If you want more poetry, I can come back. And it's
What's New in Health and Medicine with Dr. Coffee Brown video and podcast is produced by Shelley Carney and Toby Eunice from the AGK Media Studio in the Land of Enchantment. Please take a moment now to subscribe and leave a great review. Then share this podcast with your family and friends so they can help heal the planet and improve their health too. Thanks for listening.